and I'll let you get on with it, Gary.
Okay, right. Good evening. What I thought I would do from the historical side of things is really just put where we are today in emergency care with where it all began. So I thought first 5 minutes or so, just really, people often talk about casualty, A&E, emergency departments. And if I go back even pre-19th century, there was no such thing as casualty departments. Basically, there was just outpatients departments in the voluntary hospitals, in the charity hospitals, and people just used to wander into the outpatients department with their injuries or their ailments. And it was really when the GPs were beginning to emerge in the 19th century that things started to change, because suddenly we were having a situation where there were doctors out there in the community that were really saying to the hospital doctors, look, you can't keep having all these patients. We actually want some of the patients, but obviously they were charging to actually see the patients. And so there was a lot of discussion, a lot of disputes, I'm sure, at the time. But the end result was that it was agreed that people just couldn't wander into hospital with any ailment that they had and be seen free of charge. And so basically what was agreed was that people would go to see GPs, and GPs would send patients to the hospitals if they needed to see a surgeon or a physician. But there was always a clause left, and this is to extent where we are even today, that if it was a true emergency, then the person would still be seen in the hospital. And so what began to emerge was, instead of the outpatients departments, hospitals started building or creating small departments that they called casualties. It's debatable whether the word casualty really comes from casual, because people used to casually attend these departments. So it's possible that the word casualty has sort of emerged from this casual attendance. That carried on even when the NHS came into play. When the NHS in 48 came, what they found was that there was this mass of departments that were all called casualties, that were all of different sizes. They were all doing different jobs. Most of them, if not all of them, were sort of looked after by an orthopaedic consultant that wasn't really interested in them. So consequently, you tended to have just junior doctors, junior nurses working in casualty departments, and there was no real control. And that went on, believe it or not, till the early 1960s. And it was in 1962 that a thing called the Platt Report was published. And the Platt Report basically said, this has got to change. We've got to have a better structure. And to start, we're going to change the name from casualty to accident and emergency. And every A&E department will have a named consultant. And basically, we will try and reduce the amount of patients coming in with trivial injuries, just feeling unwell, and it should be true accident and emergencies. And so that was the beginning, really, of emergency care as we know it today. Now, interestingly enough, although it was a named consultant, very few departments in the 60s had A&E consultants. And in fact, those of you that are locally in Essex will not believe it, but Basildon did not have a dedicated accident and emergency consultant until 1991, when we centralised the A&E services from Orsett. Orsett had an A&E consultant from about 1970, 71, somewhere around that sort of time. But Basildon always had a nominated orthopaedic consultant. And when I took over Basildon in 86, as well as looking after Orsett, I felt as though I needed to give that consultant a map and compass to find their way to the A&E department. So there was a distinct difference between the way Orsett was run and the way Basildon was run from a medical point of view. Nowadays, you'll probably find lots of departments losing the title accident, and a lot of them are now titling themselves emergency departments rather than accident and emergency departments. There's two reasons for that. One reason is, again, it's trying to dissuade people to go there with minor ailments and illnesses that can be dealt with by the GP. But also, it's a major discussion that we've been having in emergency care for some time. Is there ever such a thing as an accident? Because the vast majority of patients that end up injured, it wasn't really an accident because it could have been prevented. So there is the big issue around whether, in fact, there is ever, in most cases, an accident. So, for example, if somebody parks their car under a cliff that says danger falling rocks, and then a rock falls on their head, was that truly an accident or was it an incident? So, you know, we could debate that all night, but that's generally why a lot of the departments are beginning to change. From a specialty, again, 1967 was before the casualty surgeons got themselves together, and it's only in 2008 that we had emerged the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. And nurses in A&E were a little bit ahead of themselves. We had our first forum in the Royal College of Nursing in 1972, and we became an association back in the 80s. And more recently, again, to take on this emergency side of things, they've changed their name in 2003 to the Royal College of Nursing Emergency Care Association. So that really just sort of gives you a good sort of background of where we've come from and where we are today. I don't know whether there's any questions on that or whether you want me to just chatter on about my life in A&E and some of the things that I've seen change.
No, that's great. Well, I didn't realise some of that information, Gary. And I think, you know, when you look at, I never knew Basildon never had a consultant until quite late. It's quite astounding, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it was an orthopaedic. I wouldn't give the people's names. It was orthopaedic consultants that used to, I'm sure in the short period that I was there, I dealt with two different consultants. One was the consultant for A&E when I went there, which was an orthopaedic consultant. And then within a couple of years, it was another orthopaedic consultant. And, you know, to be honest, and this is why things changed in the 60s, the orthopaedic consultants didn't really want casualty at all, didn't really want A&E. But there always, as you know, Phil, has to be a nominated consultant looking after anything in the NHS. But honestly, you know, I don't ever remember in the years that I was there until 91 seeing the consultant who was in charge of A&E in the department, whereas also, as you will know, Ernst was there every day. So it's interesting.
Yeah, we've got just a little bit of break up on yours, Gary, now.
Consultants at Basildon.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello, Gary. Hello. Gary.
Yeah, hello.
Hello. Yeah, we've got a little bit of break up on connection.
Yeah, I can still hear.
Yeah.
You still there? Hello, Gary.
I can see standing still, Phil. You froze.
Yeah, you're freezing a bit.
Hello?
We can, I can see and hear.
Yeah, it seems to be you that talking to me normally. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, he's frozen again.
So I'm talking to Frank and I'm talking to Claire. Sorry. Hello.
That's Jason.
Jason.
Oh, hi. Nice to meet you.
Did you say you've just texted Phil to tell him that he's the problem?
I'm just going to let him know so he knows that in case he's not getting the messages and things for us.
I think he's thinking that I'm the problem.
I think he
No, it's not you, Gary.
No.
Jolly good.
What's the problem, Jace?
You.
What about you?
Not the first time he's said that.
Can you hear okay, Phil?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, so you've come back. I think we're back to square one then, Gary.
Yeah, oh, very good.
Okay, right. Sorry, Gary, carry on.
That's all right. I was chatting away to all the others and you suddenly went frozen. You were just sitting like a photograph on my screen.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a bit of the history of it. I mean, if you want me to just have a little chat about from where I was and where I am now, I mean, I first went into A&E back in 75, and if I compare what it was like in 75 when I was on nights to today, if I went over to Basildon or went into any A&E department today, you just cannot imagine the difference, because one of the big things when I was on nights and even during my day period during the 80s was we didn't have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week lifestyle. So consequently, come 1 a.m. in the morning, unless it was a Saturday night maybe, the department would be empty. I mean, if I saw 3, 4, 5 patients during the hours of 1 a.m. till 8 a.m. in the morning, I was, busy. Having said that, we didn't have the staff as people have got now on duty, but nevertheless, you tended to have a situation where Monday to Friday, people went to bed or they were working nights. So the type of patients that we would see would be people that perhaps had suddenly got a heart attack or had breathing difficulties during the early hours of the morning, or we would see people that were working on night shifts in factories and they would obviously come in with injuries. The amount of road traffic incidents that we dealt with in the early hours of the morning would be very, very small. Friday night, Saturday nights, we would always be busier because people would tend to be out later. Certainly in the Thurrock area, there was very little in the way of nightlife. I think Saturday night, the only place you could probably go after midnight would be the Circus Tavern. Other than that, there wasn't very much. There was odd clubs around, and if any of you know Tilbury, you always used to dread Saturday night and the Toot Club, as it was called, which was near the docks, because that always presented a few problems to us, shall I say. I can see Janice nodding away there, and she can remember, obviously, some of that as well. During the day, when I went on to days in the 70s and the 80s, again, although we were busier and year on year, figures were growing all the time, again, we didn't have the volume of patients that often is seen now in the departments. And one of the questions often people pose is why? Why has there been such a massive upsurge? Well, I sort of put it under sort of 4 big headings, really. We haven't got enough beds in the hospital. So more and more patients are staying in the A&E departments. The community services that theoretically were supposed to have developed 30 odd years ago to counterbalance the closure of beds has never really occurred in the way that it had to occur for the amount of patients. We've got a massive upsurge in the population, and we've got a reduction basically in A&E departments and hospitals. So we've got this bizarre situation where we've got more people requiring emergency care due to age, due to increased population, etc. And yet we've actually reduced the amount of A&E departments and the amount of beds in hospitals that have got A&E departments. And then people wonder why there's ambulances queuing up at the doors and all the A&E departments are full up with patients. So that's sort of, I think, where we are at the moment. But to be on a very positive rather than negative note, in the last 30 years, so much has developed in emergency care that is good, that while it doesn't outweigh the problems that are currently in A&E departments, I think we have to, realise that 30 years ago, if you had a multiple injury, you would probably die because we didn't have trauma teams, we didn't have paramedics, we didn't have a trauma system that is like we've got today. And really that all comes over from Canada and America, because 30 odd years ago, America had paramedics because they didn't know what to do with all these emergency technicians that come back from South Korea. So that's how the paramedic program started in America. And they identified trauma care early on. So I was lucky to go out and see some of this stuff in 1980. And, when I was standing in some of their trauma centres and I was seeing consultant surgeons, consultant anaesthetists, a whole team looking after a multiply injured patient. And then I came back to Orsett and I'd got a registrar and a couple of house officers if I was lucky. It was not surprising that our trauma care wasn't as good. Now, you go to some of the big hospitals now, or even if you go over to Basildon, and you will see a coordinated trauma team in the same way as you had a cardiac arrest team in the days that I was in A&E. So we've got paramedics that are doing far more. We've got the helicopters, which obviously in some degree are really good. I think sometimes helicopters come and you could well just still be using an ambulance. But having said that, the fact that the helicopters can get there and can take patients to places like the Royal London or to Addenbrooke's for specialist care, that has to be good. We've centralised a lot of cardiac stuff. So Basildon has got its cardiac unit there where people can be rushed into. Stroke systems, again, for people having strokes. If we look at A&E, we've got triage systems that are much more sophisticated than they were. I mean, pre the 80s, triage was really just very hit and miss, whereas now it's much more organised. And so there's a tremendous amount of positive work going on in emergency care. But unfortunately, because of the problems that I mentioned earlier, it's often overshadowed, because on the news we tend to just see the issues around trolley waits and ambulances queuing up at A&Es. And I think it's right that it has to be publicised, and it needs to be publicised a lot more, because, again, coming back to what I was saying earlier, until we sort out the community services, until we increase bed capacity in the hospitals, I don't think we'll ever resolve those problems. So that's a lot. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, no, it's very true though, Gary. It's very true. Yeah.
It must be very frustrating for the staff
It's extremely frustrating for the staff. I don't work in emergency care on a day-to-day basis now, but I still do a lot of trauma training, and I meet up with lots of colleagues that work in emergency departments across the UK and in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and the frustration for those nurses, those doctors, is enormous. They really have problems because they don't get any downtime at all now, and that's one of the big issues. When I worked in A&E, when we used to have a cardiac arrest, when we used to have a serious trauma patient, when we dealt with that patient and the patient had gone off to the ward or intensive care, we had the opportunity to sort of chat through with each other. Did it go well? Could we have done better, etc., etc.? There was a bit of downtime, whereas now, and you know, I honestly struggle to remember a day when every single trolley and every single chair would have been full. I struggle to think of a day when I would have had more than about 2 ambulances arriving simultaneously. So the pressure is just unbelievable now. When I walk through, I still pop over to Basildon now and again, not to the A&E, but to another part of the hospital. And when I walk past A&E and I see 8, 9, 10 ambulances all standing there, obviously delivering patients, I just think, my goodness, thank goodness I was in the days that I was in A&E. And colleagues that I know, that, like myself, that have left A&E, we often say to each other, you know, we're glad we're not there now, even though, you know, it would be good. I didn't leave because of any of that, because I left in 91. So it really hadn't started in a big way. I left purely to change a career, but stay within the emergency care field. I don't know whether there's any questions. Phil also said you might be interested in a few little sort of stories, but if there's any questions about A&E generally, I'm happy to sort of take that on board.
I understood that the National Health Service was the biggest, or one of the biggest employers in Europe, and yet it seems that they're always saying we haven't got enough doctors,
Yeah,
not enough nurses, not enough midwives.
yes.
They are the biggest employer. Who are they employing?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question. Let me say that in the years since I've left the hospital, I've seen more and more administrative staff than probably I ever saw. Now, why is that? Well, 1986, the hospital, the NHS, become a business. I don't know whether any of you remember, but Mr. Sainsbury was asked to review the NHS and hospitals, and he came out with the idea that the way it was managed was totally unsuitable for today's business focus, and we had to have chief executives and we had to have money controlling the whole process. So we suddenly saw a massive upsurge in finance directors, finance staff, general managers, and then of course in 91 we created trusts, and so the trusts became even more business-like. We move money round the system now. So just as I was leaving, it was all beginning to happen. For the first time ever in my life as a manager, I was given my budget, and I was told I had to look after my budget, and I could only have the nurses that my budget fitted, etc., etc. And then the pathology department had a budget, and somebody else had a budget, and somebody else had a budget. But in fact, it was the same money just being sent round and round in circles. And to actually send all that money round and round in circles, you had to create massive financial departments. And in a sense, that is still where we are today. I mean, some finance directors probably earn more than the Prime Minister. It is a real big problem. Now, governments have tried to sort this out, but until we recognise the fact that we're running a business now in the NHS, and I don't believe the NHS is a business in the same way as other businesses. It's a service, and that's the problem. And when we come to nurses, every time I go to the Royal College of Nursing Congress, we're told by politicians there's more nurses. But when you actually look at it, because of the way student nurses now are educated, the vast majority of increase are healthcare assistants, not necessarily registered nurses. So there's, it's the classic let's play with figures. But only this evening on the 6 o'clock news, there was Hunt talking about problems in midwifery and issues around the midwifery service. And one of the big things that was said, not by him, but by others being interviewed, was there's not enough midwives. So we're back again to the issue around staffing. So, it is a big problem. I wouldn't like to be the health secretary. I wouldn't like to be trying to sort this out. But I think, somebody somewhere, and my personal view, and I would love to see it happen, and I think there's lots of other people that feel the same, is I would like to take the NHS out of the government and actually have it run, if you like, by a consensus of different parties. In other words, don't just have the NHS run by the Conservatives or the Labour or whoever's in power, but actually have some other political structure that is non-political, if you like, within NHS.
Yeah, that would make a lot more sense, wouldn't it? Really would.
Yeah.
Well, I think so, because, everyone that comes in reorganises. I mean, we've had so many reorganisations of the NHS. People are so... I'm when I'm teaching, and I mainly deal with community nurses now, and when I'm teaching them, they genuinely sometimes say to me, I have no idea who my manager is. I have no idea who actually is running the show. And I went over and spoke to a group of nurses a year or so ago, and they were anticipating the whole of the community services, district nurses, the whole lot. They were waiting to know whether they were going to be taken over by Virgin Medical. So it's crazy. South Essex Partnership Trust, which is the mental health and the community services. I mean, I've met staff there where 1 minute they're employed by one part of the NHS and the next day they're employed by another part of the NHS, because under the trust system, they have to every so many years vie for their services. I mean, it's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, that's madness, isn't it? And it doesn't do the morale any good, does it really?
No, not at all. No. I mean, Phil and Janice will know, when we were at Orsett, we knew who our boss was. We knew exactly what the structure was because it was very simplistic. And you knew that the senior nurse of the hospital was your boss, and the senior nurse of the hospital was accountable to a district management group, and that was it. That was the long and the short of it. But there's so many different ways now. You know, you can work in one part of the country and be managed by someone down 100, 200 miles away. When you look at a hospital now, it's not necessarily all run by the same people. Different parts of the hospital might be run by different organisations. If you go to Orsett, which is not really a hospital in the true sense anymore, it's more outpatients and day surgery, etc., etc. But a part of that is run by Basildon and Thurrock, a part is run by North East London, a part is run by Southend. So, you know, it's very different to the days when I was there. And despite all of this, you know, when you actually look at the care that patients receive, on the whole, it is really good. You know, people will moan, obviously, and people will be complaining sometimes about the care. But if you look at the thousands and thousands of patients that go through emergency care and intensive care and so on and so forth, you know, the vast majority of people get really good service from the doctors, from the nurses, etc. So, you know, although I'm not happy with the way the system works, and I think, you know, that is some of the problems that we see on the day-to-day issues in emergency care, overall, you know, it is really good care. So if you go in with your heart attack now, the paramedics will be able to treat you at your house. If you live within the South Essex area, you'll go straight into the South Essex cardiac unit. You'll probably be in theatre within, you know, an hour or so, having your stent put in or your clot deblocked. If you suffer a major trauma on the A13 or the M25, you'll either be flown to the Royal London and there'll be a whole massive team of people waiting for you there, or you'll go to Basildon and have a trauma team waiting for you there. So, you know, there's lots of positives, even though there's a lot of problems within the NHS.
It sounds very much like lions led by donkeys.
I couldn't possibly comment. I mean, what's really interesting is the way, you know, from the paramedic point of view, because when I was in A&E, we didn't have paramedics. You know, the ambulance service was very much sort of pick the patient up and take the patient to the hospital. And, you know, I can remember in the very early days when I joined the Red Cross when I was about 16, the adult Red Cross at Grays, the ambulance staff used to come to the Red Cross for their first aid lessons. And that was literally the only training they had. So at Orsett, very early on when Dr. Ernst first started there, we actually run a mobile accident team. And so a doctor and a nurse used to go out to the scene of serious incidents because obviously there wasn't such a thing as paramedics. And, you know, from my point of view, that was always great fun to actually go out there. And, you know, I was a very junior staff nurse on nights when I first went out, and we went down to West Thurrock, and somebody was trapped at the top of a very, very tall chimney stack. And I remember as we drove in, I said to the doctor, "Have you ever done anything like this before?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Nor have I." The two of us got out of the ambulance, and there was all these fire tenders and police and ambulance, and it was pitch black dark. And they said to me, "The patient's up there," and I couldn't even see the top of the chimney stack. And I thought, oh my God. And luckily, just as I was sort of preparing to climb up this ladder, they shouted down saying, "We've got him free, we're bringing him down." And I have to say, the sweat on my suddenly diminished, and I was pleased I never did go up that chimney. But we used to have some good fun on the mobile accident team, and saw some really interesting situations. And that was like some of the cases, obviously, in the department itself. You know, there was the funny side of, we always used to see the funny side of life if we could, and sometimes it was very sad. You got to know patients. One patient I remember we got to know so well that when he died one night in our department, I had the whole of the staff in tears, and his wife was there, and I just thought, gosh, what is she going to think? And I dealt with the wife, and I, you know, sort of said, I'm really sorry, there was nothing this time that we could do. And it was several weeks afterwards, one of the nurses who worked in another part of the hospital, who knew the family very well, she come down and she said to me, she said, the chap's wife just wanted to say how amazing everybody was. And the thing that struck her the most was the fact that all the nurses were in tears, and that showed her how much they thought of her husband. And I thought there was a positive came out of that. You know, she really understood that we liked the man, and we wanted to do everything that we could. And everybody was so distraught when we lost the battle. So, you know, there's some sad times, but there's also, you know, some funny times. And we used to do split shifts, and I never liked coming back at 5 o'clock in the evening when the department was busy. I always used to like to have a fairly empty department and start from scratch. Now, if I was working in emergency care today, I wouldn't have that option because I'd just walk into a full department. But the staff knew that I didn't particularly like that. So one evening when I came back at 5 o'clock, there was curtains around every trolley. There was lots of noise. The resus room, the doors were closed. And one of the sisters, who was a right character called Mac, who Phil and Janice will know, she came out, oh, Gary, she said, you know, oh my God, it's been a terrible afternoon. You're going to have a dreadful evening. So I said, come on then, let's start. And she opened the doors of the resus room, and there was a teddy bear laying on the resus trolley. And as she took me around the department, there was teddy bears and dolls on all the trolleys. The place was empty. And they just, all the staff just stood there smiling, loving the fact that I was getting irritated because I thought I was going to be really taking over a very busy department. So we used to have fun as well as some sadness, really. It was a good place.
You can't have the fun anymore, Gary.
Sorry?
Can't have the fun anymore.
No, I think some of them try. I mean, you know, as I say, Phil, I meet up with lots of A&E nurses, and there's still a lot of enthusiasm there, and they still want to enjoy it as much as they can. But yeah, it's absolutely right. You know, in fact, it's interesting. There's a person who I still go and see, a very good friend of mine in Southern Ireland, and she used to be one of the sisters with me at Orsett, and she does 2 nights a week in the A&E department at Tralee, and she just makes a comparison between the days we were at Orsett and the nights that she has now in A&E, and she says you couldn't even begin to make a comparison, because from the minute she walks in till the minute she walks out, she's on the go all the time.
Yeah, I can believe that. Yeah, that's Diane, is it? Diane.
It is. Yeah, it is indeed. Yes. Yeah, she still enjoys it though, despite all of the busyness of it.
Yeah.
Gary?
Yes?
For those sort of traumatic times you mentioned as well when at work in the hospital there, would you have had some sort of counsellors within that department to help the staff?
We didn't in the days when I was there. This is something that has been introduced over the years. What we used to do though, because we actually had the time as opposed to now, our counselling was really talking with each other. So when I was saying earlier about if you'd had a patient that had an arrest or a multiply injured patient, whether they'd survived or whether they'd died, you normally had a period where you could talk about what had happened. Now, that was usually while you were tidying everything up, replenishing equipment, etc. But what you would actually be doing was talking to each other and saying, how did that go? Did you think that went well? You know, what went wrong, etc. So in a sense, that was our counselling.
Sort of an outlet for it.
Absolutely, yeah. And when I've talked to colleagues that have seen much, much more in the way of serious stuff, I mean, a lot of my friends, not so much now, but in previous years, that used to work in Northern Ireland in the Troubles. Again, they didn't have formal counselling, but what they used to do was actually look after each other. I mean, a very good friend of mine, unfortunately, she died a few years ago. She was the senior sister of the A&E at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and she was there throughout the whole of the Troubles. And she used to say to me that if they'd had a really horrendous evening, and bearing in mind, like in my days, a lot of your staff were student nurses, 18, 19-year-old students who had never seen anything like that. She would say that what they used to do was all of the families, the nurses that lived at home with their families, they would take the students home with them. So they'd sort of, if there was 6 students on that night, they'd all go home for the evening. Instead of going back to the nurses' home, they'd take them home and look after them for the night, because they didn't want them just sitting in the nurses' home on their own. So a lot of situations are often dealt with by the staff themselves. I remember another very good friend of mine, she used to be the nurse manager of University College Hospital in London. And she had to deal with her staff with King's Cross, the King's Cross fire. And she said that the next morning, she moved her office to the coffee room. And she stayed in that coffee room for the whole of that week. And staff used to come in and they would just sit down and they'd talk to her about how they felt and what it was like the evening dealing with some of those, horrendously burnt patients. And so a lot of the counselling that we used to do in those days were really between ourselves. Now, if you talk to staff today, they will often say, as fast as one patient goes out of the resus room, another one's coming in. And so the amount of time they have to talk to each other and sort of counsel themselves, if you like, is much less. And so what you see now is there are more formalised processes that go on in a lot of hospitals.
Do we lose a lot of nurses? I mean, and sort of they train, they go through that, then they start for real.
Yeah. I don't know the figures by any means. I know from an emergency nursing point of view, a lot of the nurses will stay in A&E for a period of time, but not necessarily as long as they used to in my days. The other problem is that there is a great need for nurses now in A&E. All of the nurse managers that I talk to today, they are always having difficulty with recruiting because nurses are basically saying, no, I don't want to work in such a busy place. Now, I used to always have a waiting list. People always wanted to come to work in A&E, and it was never a problem for me to have staff. Excuse me. And a lot of the staff used to be waiting to want to get the sister's job or the charge nurse job. A lot of staff now that are working in emergency care don't necessarily want to become senior nurses in A&E. A very good friend of mine, she's one of the matrons of emergency care in Manchester. And she says to me, the main problems they have at the moment is getting staff at what you would call the sister or the charge nurse position, because a lot of their work now is actually about firefighting all the time. Where can I put this patient? How am I going to deal with this volume of people? And again, today, we've missed our targets, because a lot of it is target driven now. 98% of patients should be seen and out of the department within 4 hours. Now, I have to say, if I'd have had patients in my department for 4 hours in the 80s, I'd have been going absolutely loopy, because it was not the norm. Because when we were there, we didn't have the volume of patients, I agree, but we had the beds. And therefore, as soon as the patient was seen, and once the decision was made that they were going to be admitted, they went to a ward. But today, they can decide they want to admit them, but there's not a bed to put them in. So they stay in A&E. So A&E is becoming more of a ward as well as an emergency department. And nurses are saying, I really don't want to take the responsibility for that. I'll actually stay as a staff nurse and look after the patients. I don't want the hassle of managing something that in a lot of places is considered to be unmanageable, really. I mean, at the end of the day, despite the fact that a lot of people disagree with me, I don't think that we're ever going to resolve it until we accept that we've got to have more beds in hospitals. I mean, if I just take Orsett and Basildon, now, if we look at 1991, when we centralised, there was 500 beds at Orsett, there was 350 odd beds at Basildon. Now then, over the period 91 till today, they built another 300 and something odd beds at Basildon, but they actually closed the 500 at Orsett. And then, of course, up the road was Harold Wood. That's no longer there. There was St Margaret's at Epping. That's no longer there. And I don't know. I wouldn't be able to tell you how many beds. But if I just take our little South Essex area, I bet we've lost hundreds, if not thousands, of beds. And yet the population has just grown beyond belief. I mean, when I was in A&E at Orsett, we didn't have Chafford 100. So how you expect to put more patients that are iller, and we're all getting older, and there's a much older population now that is getting sicker. And it was all supposed to be, well, we'll do it all in the community. But unfortunately, the community, although it has improved tremendously, don't get me wrong, there's a tremendous amount of good going on in the community now, but not to the extent to take all those patients that are still sitting in hospital waiting to be looked after in the community.
Yeah. No,
Gary, do you think we're lacking nurses?
Overall, the Royal College of Nursing, I mean, I can only go by where the Royal College of Nurses come from. They will always insist, based on the figures, that the overall number of nurses compared with what we should have for the amount of patients that we're seeing is reduced. Same with doctors. That's why they've just announced a big surge in getting lots more doctors into the system. So yeah, we've got a lot of problems with staffing, and a lot of nurses. The argument about training nurses has just hit the headlines as well. You probably have heard in the news about student nurses not getting a bursary anymore, but actually having to pay, not pay up front, but pay in the same way as other students going to universities. Now, the government are arguing that allows as many nurses, as many students as universities can cope with to actually be trained. So they argue that it will actually increase the number of student nurses going into the system. the RCN and others are saying it won't, because people will look at other things rather than going into nursing because they won't have the bursary. Now, I have to say, I don't know enough about it to make a comment on that. But we certainly overall have got less nurses. And there's big arguments now about staffing ratios, and that's become quite political. Wales is the first country out of the 4 countries of the UK that have actually passed an act of their, I say their parliament, their assembly, that is giving a mechanism of measuring ratios of nurses, registered nurses, to patients. And that's the first country that's done it. Scotland is in the process of doing it. England at the moment is not anywhere near thinking about that. And I'm not sure Northern Ireland is either. But it's interesting how Wales and Scotland have been working the governments of the 2 countries have been working very closely with, like, the Royal College of Nursing and other unions that relate to health, to try and get some sort of proper act of assembly or a parliament with what ratio of nurses you should have. Yeah, one of the big problems at the moment is, of course, people and the government are classic of this. They talk about nurses as opposed to talking about registered nurses and nursing. They tend to lump everybody together. So you can be a healthcare assistant, you can be a university 2-year associate practitioner nurse, and then you can be a registered nurse. But they lump everybody together when they're talking about, oh yeah, the figures are up. But in fact, if you actually look at it, it's often the registered nurses are down and the healthcare assistants are up. So it's a bit of a...
I'm a careers manager in a secondary school, Gary, and
Right.
the NHS don't seem to promote themselves in a positive way.
Right.
In about 3 years, I think I've had about 8 students that want to go into that industry.
Yes.
And whenever I contact them to come to careers fairs or open days,
Yes.
very rarely get a response.
Yeah.
And they send you paperwork, but they don't actually come and talk to the students. So all the negative stuff of the NHS sort of comes through,
Yes.
and we're not recruiting any new blood, if you like,
Yeah.
into the system.
Yeah. One of the problems there is that the NHS and the universities that obviously deal with the students, they're totally separate, albeit that they have to work together. So again, if I go back to my day, the local hospital, Orsett, came to our school. I remember them coming and doing, and I'm sure Phil and Janice possibly might remember as well, they would come to the school because when I wanted to go into nursing, I actually had to apply to the hospital and I become a student of the hospital. Nowadays, you become a student in the university, and in a sense, you have no connection in an employment side of things with the NHS. And although students go to work in hospitals and they often go to the same hospital, the hospital and the student really are somewhat divorced. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine who's a nurse in Broomfield, when she was a student, she was at Anglia Ruskin University, and she used to go to Broomfield for her placement, along with all her other colleagues from that university. When they qualified, about 3 months before they qualified, Broomfield Hospital had gone and recruited a lot of nurses from various countries. And so when they came out of university, something like only 2 or 3 of them got a job at Broomfield. The rest of them actually were left without any jobs, and they had to go and find jobs in other hospitals. Now, that would have never happened in our system because we actually were always guaranteed jobs when we qualified, and in fact it was expected that you stayed at least 6 months post-registration. So what I would like to see is, you're quite right, I would like to see the NHS and the universities doing much more together. And while we'll never go back to the days where students become employees of the hospital, I think what should happen is that there should be a much greater connection between the hospital and the community, obviously, because a lot more is going on in the community. So there needs to be a much more connection between them and the universities, and they ought to be coming to your school jointly, I would suggest.
I agree.
You know, the pupils know exactly what the game is, that yes, they're going to go to university. This is the university that's recruiting in your area, but this is the NHS that they're going to work in. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that, absolutely.
Any more questions for Gary?
No.
Very informative. Thank you.
Very good,
Right,
Gary.
over to you. Further thanks, Gary. Please, Frank.
That's all right. Pleasure.
Gary, I would like to thank you on behalf of everybody. That was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful talk. It really, really was informative. A lot of stuff there that even I wasn't aware of, and absolutely brilliant. Everybody, I would like you to join hands and a real big clap for Gary, and many, many thanks.
Thank you.
Good to meet you.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
So grateful for your time, Gary. I'll send you the link that will be downloaded onto